Hi, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. If you haven't already grabbed some wonderful snacks, treats, please feel free at any time during the presentation to get up, grab your snacks, get some more waters. There's going to be a lot left over, so please also at the end, grab some and take them with you, okay? Whether you live 5 minutes away, 20 minutes away, whatever, grab some snacks for the road. Well, welcome to the 4th annual Dr. Lydia Thering and Miss Joan Hedrick Academic Enrichment Lecture. I'm Jean Thompson. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Advancement here at the university. We're thrilled to have you all here for this wonderful topic and to hear from our speaker, Bob Powell. When Dr. Thering first approached us about establishing this endowed fund, her and Joan's goal was to provide free lectures and other learning opportunities that would enhance the visibility of our great university as a liberal arts institution, with areas of focus being health, wellness, and community relevant topics for the enrichment of the university as well as the broader community. Let me just tell you very briefly a little bit about Dr. Thering and Ms. Hedrick. They both served the university for a combined total of 70 years in the physical education department. Both gained faculty emeritus status upon retirement. They were truly dedicated to the university and our students, as well as women's sports and their commitment to health and well-being. Unfortunately, Joan passed away in 2014 before the lecture series even began. And more recently, we lost Dr. Thering in 2023. However difficult that was for us, I find comfort in knowing that both Dr. Thering and Ms. Hedrick vision and legacy will last in perpetuity through this endowed lecture fund. I'd like to thank the Continuing Education Department for being the unit on our campus that manages this fund and for getting everybody here today, especially Catherine Gaman and Beatrice Dornfeld. In addition, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the additional UWS committee members, Shannon Hoffman, Sarah Libben, Nick Bursick, Allison Garver, Brandon Iverson, and Daniel Rust. They are the star-studded committee on our campus that has helped put everything together. At this time, I would like to introduce Bob Powell. Bob is an award-winning financial journalist whose work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, and Yahoo Finance, just to name a few. In addition, he's the editor of the Retirement Management Journal, the host of 2 podcasts. I'm told Dr. Bob is how they refer to you in one of those, and an instructor in the Financial Planning Association's Elder Planning Specialist course. So at this time, I would like to bring Bob Powell forward. Thank you.
Testing 1, 2, testing. All right. Perfect. I'm going to bring it. All right. Okay.
Yeah. There you are.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this lecture series. I'm quite honored and grateful for the opportunity to talk about some of my favorite subjects with you all. I also want to wish Shana Tova to those of that faith who might be in attendance tonight. And I'd also like to say that I'm especially grateful to be here because Wisconsin holds a special place in my heart. I did my undergrad at Marquette University in Milwaukee in the 1970s. And I always felt like Wisconsin was a particularly great place to come of age when you're 19, 20, 21.
Still looked up.
Okay. And then fast forward a few years after my daughter was born, graduates high school, deciding where to go to college. We looked all over, well, mostly east of Mississippi. We looked all over from Tulane to Syracuse to Northeastern to Madison. And deep down in my heart, I was hoping that she would pick Madison when she decided. And lo and behold, she did. So she's a Badger, and now she's 5 hours away going to a football game. So She's like, Dad, come visit. I'm like, it's 5 hours away. I can't do that. Couple quick questions before I start. Anyone from the Promethean staff here by chance? Good. This is all off the record, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. So just a show of hands. Curious, who here is from the community? Great, welcome. Who here is with, who's faculty? Great, and students? Fantastic. So it's a great broad range of people who are here, and we'll try to make sure that we cover content that's applicable to everyone who's here. And then what I'm going to do is our agenda is the state of financial literacy, retirement planning 101, and then time permitting, I've got a couple other topics. When I was preparing for this speech, Catherine and others kept asking if I could cover this and that and this and that. So I threw all this and that into the slide presentation. And so that this deck is about 95 slides long. We're not going to get through it all, but maybe we will if I speak fast enough, because I'm from Boston and goodness knows we sometimes talk quickly. But what I think what will happen is if we don't get to any of these topics, you'll have the deck and then you can go back and refer to all the things that we don't get to. Yeah, I'm not going to read this, but I play old man hockey. So one of the things, I know this is like kind of a hockey town, so just wanted to see if I could get into your good graces by showing you that I have a love for hockey. And once won, we call that the coffee cup. And if you're lucky enough to win it, you get your name on it, just like the Stanley Cup, but it's not nearly as prestigious, but it is to those of us whose name is on it. Just a little bit about my background, I think is sort of instructive. In the 1980s, after I graduated college, I became a stockbroker for what was then called Dean Witter Reynolds. At the time, Dean Witter Reynolds was part of the Sears Financial Network, Sears, which sold tires and sewing machines and socks and whatnot. And the Sears Financial Network was comprised of Allstate, Coldwell Banker, and Dean Witter Reynolds. And I was put into an all-rookie office in White Plains, New York. And every 7 days or so, I would have to go into the Sears store in Stamford, in the basement next to the tires and batteries and whatnot, and try and sell stocks to people. And at the time, the brokerage industry was such that it was a very commission-oriented place. And that's how you earned a living, by trying to persuade people to do things that they shouldn't. And I wasn't very good at this job. I did try it for 2 years, and I completely failed, because whenever someone would ask me whether a stock would go up or not, I would say, beats the heck out of me, sir. It's a stock. It could easily just as well go down. It's a risky investment. So I really failed at it. And the time that proved the case was once I was in the Sears store, I think it was a Friday or Saturday night, and a gentleman had come in. He had just sold his house, and he came into the most money that he'd ever had in his entire life, but he had no knowledge about investing. So we sat down at my desk with my green banker's lamp, and we started going through the investment pyramid, and we started talking about safety of principal, things like money markets and CDs. And then we went up the investment pyramid till we got to, well, there was no Bitcoin at the time, but we got to gold and platinum and precious metals and whatnot. And then at one point, all the lights in the Sears store went off, except for my green banker's lamp. And the store had closed. I didn't hear that, you have 5 minutes to get out of the store, we're closing. So we were locked in the Sears store, me and this prospect. And we had to call the Stanford police. They called the store manager. The store manager came down. He got us out of the building. And the next day I went to the office. I was telling the branch manager the story, and he said, well, did you close the guy? You were locked in the building with him. How could you not close him? And I'm like, I didn't close him. He took the money to a bank and put it in a CD, and probably the best thing he should have done with the money at the time, given his lack of knowledge around investment. I lasted 2 years doing that, but what I discovered was I had developed a love of the market and of personal finance, and also while I tried to sell stocks during the day, I started writing at night, and I started writing about money, and that led me to a career as what sometimes people refer to as an ink-stained wretch. It's okay to heckle me during this presentation. I have a thick skin and a short memory, so it's okay. I don't mind. It's okay to ask questions. So we're going to start with the state of financial literacy. About 20 years ago, Anna Lusardi, and Olivia Mitchell of UPenn Wharton started investigating financial literacy. And they started with, I'm not going to read their background, but they came up with these big 3 questions that were in the health and retirement study that has been going on for decades now. And they asked these 3 big financial literacy survey questions. And I'd like you all to, maybe if you have a pen or a piece of paper in front of you, just to look at the question and then write down the answer, A, B, C, or D. Give you 5 seconds. Good. All right. Next question. Imagine that the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year and inflation was 2%. After 1 year, how much would you be able to buy with that money in this account? Same question, A, B, C, D, write it down. It's okay. I'm not going to call on you if you fail. And then the last question is, please tell me whether this statement is true or false. Buying a single company's stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. True, false, don't know. Refuse to answer. All right, here are the answers. You'd have more than $102 for the first question. Everyone got that right? Of course you did. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Less than today. Everyone got that one? Great. And then false. Great. Perfect. I'm going to go home, or let's go to the brew pub that you talked about, Catherine. All right. So you might say, these 3 questions really don't address financial literacy. But the truth of the matter is that they do, but not fully. But they do in the sense that they are reliable, they are valid, they are useful. They address broad concepts. And so it allows researchers to administer these items in numerous countries, whether it's the US or Denmark or Poland or wherever it is. These questions have been offered up around the world. And the response, right? We just did that survey in under a minute, under 2 minutes. So it's minimal response burden. And then we can compare the results across various populations. Fast forward to 2016, Anna ends up working with the TIA Institute, which probably offers you your 403B here, maybe, or not, maybe. Anyway, so she starts a new study called the PFIN Index, Personal Finance Index. And the most recent publication, I think it's the 8th annual edition of this is now out. And in their finding, only 16% of the people had a high level of financial literacy by answering 22 of now 28 questions correctly. You can read the full report at that URL when you get the deck. Now, what's interesting about these 28 questions is they come from the National Standards for Financial Literacy, and they cover these 8 areas: earnings, savings, consuming, investing, borrowing, insuring, comprehending risk, and go-to information sources. And what's sad about this survey from my perspective is this. Only US adults answered only 48% of the 28 questions correctly. And that's been the case since the survey began. So for all our efforts at trying to increase financial literacy, we ultimately have failed. It's remained constant all this time. And what we show is that low levels of financial literacy are particularly unique among the most vulnerable groups, African Americans, et cetera. And that these findings represent what Anna and Olivia call a call to action. So what do people know the most and least about? Not surprisingly, they know a lot about borrowing and saving and less about investing, insuring, and comprehending risk. I'm going to talk more about comprehending risk in a little bit. Am I blocking your view, by the way? No. Okay, so where are the gaps in financial knowledge? Well, in a way, this is not surprising. Those who are 60 plus know a lot about money, and those who are in college or just entering the workforce know a little bit less. Gen Z on average answered only 37% of the index questions compared to the average of, say, 50%. And then this is perhaps not surprising either. The PFIN index says that men are about 10 points higher relative to women with their knowledge of financial literacy. And these gaps are sort of consistent, as we saw before, on average, borrowing down to comprehending risk, where men are certainly a little bit more literate at borrowing, certainly a little bit more literate comprehending risk, and women less so across the board. And then there's quite a few people who just answer, I don't know. 20%, 31% don't know anything about these topics at all. So it's not only did they not get the question right or answered it incorrectly, they said, I don't know. And that's a little bit troubling too. So some of the findings are that it's evident that greater financial literacy translates into greater financial well-being, and that lower financial literacy translates into lower financial well-being. And that those who have high levels of financial literacy versus those who have very low are, in this case, they're very low are twice as likely to be debt constrained, 3.5 times likely to be financially fragile. And we'll talk about that is 4 times more likely to lack 1 month of emergency savings, which is sort of a basic financial planning recommendation. 3 times more likely to be not at all confident about their retirement income prospects. And also 3 times more likely to spend 10+ hours thinking about money during the week. So comprehending risk has consistently, as you saw, has been the area of lowest functional knowledge. Only 35% of these questions are answered correctly in 2024. And in the survey, Olivia and Anna talk about not knowing what risk means relative to investing. And these 3 topics are what they're referring to specifically. People don't have a good understanding of what risk diversification is, or what the risk return trade-off is, or what the long-term prospects of investing in the market are. And what we know is with respect to risk diversification, you probably have all heard this before. It's this notion of not putting all your eggs in one basket. And it allows you to have investments where one might be going up and one goes down. And then the following year, the one that went down might go up and the one that went up might go down. But on average, the returns would be somewhat consistent. In terms of the risk return trade-off, the notion is the higher the risk, the greater the return. And that's something that sometimes is lost on people. They think about the returns, but not necessarily the risk that's associated with investing. And the last is this notion of how does risk affect investments over the long term? And the chart that you see here might be a little fuzzy, but it says, here's what the stocks have done if you had invested in any 1 year. The best and worst annualized returns would be stock market could go up 53% in 1 year. It could equally go down 37% in 1 year as well. So holding a stock for 1 year can be really, really risky. But if you hold stocks for 30+ years, your average return in the best of those 30-year periods would be 9.86, and in the worst of them would be -4. So what was turned out to be a very risky investment for 1 year becomes less risky over time. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about retirement risk. We're going to come back to retirement again, but I always think about planning for retirement is all about the rewards. I'm saving to accumulate a nest egg that will fund my standard of living for 30 years in retirement. And that's fun to think about. But once you get to retirement, I think the equation changes from thinking about returns and rewards to what are the risks that I'll face in retirement and how do I manage and mitigate those risks. So this comes from an author I'll refer to in a second. A risk is considered relevant if all the following conditions are met. If the risk involves an identifiable hazard, if you have exposure to that hazard, if the consequences are severe enough that they cannot be ignored, and that the probability of negative consequences occurring is high enough to make the risk consequences combination relevant. So I want you to think about that. I'm not going to go deeper into it, but this notion of how do we approach risk is sort of based on these 4 concepts. And according to the principles of risk management, this is how you would mitigate some of the risks that you might face. So for instance, if something was high frequency and high severity, you might avoid it. An example might be, I don't think I should go skydiving because the risk of negative consequences is pretty high if I should do it. On the other hand, something that has low frequency and high severity, I would use insurance for. So the examples there would be, I need auto insurance, I need life insurance, I need property and casualty insurance. There's a very low frequency of having a car accident, but the consequences of it could be quite severe. So I want to insure that risk. And then the other risk mitigation techniques would be that you might retain it or reduce it if there was low severity, low frequency, or low severity, high frequency. Now, the Society of Actuaries has identified at least 15 risks that you'll face in retirement. And I know that might be hard to read now, but you'll have the deck. But it ranges from inflation, longevity, sequence of return risk, stock market risk, interest rate risk, healthcare shocks, death of a spouse, divorce, et cetera, et cetera. And what I like to think about when I'm thinking about planning for retirement is if I'm going to face all these risks, I need to put it into some sort of spreadsheet that uses the metrics that I just mentioned a second ago. Is there an identifiable hazard? Am I exposed to that hazard? what are the consequences? Are they negative? What's the probability of that event happening? And then how will I manage and mitigate that risk? Will I insure it? Will I retain the risk? Will I avoid the risk, et cetera? So when I talk to financial planners, one of the things I say is with your clients, in order to help them make sure that they have a comfortable retirement, is to go through a process where you're going through a spreadsheet of this sort and saying, dear Mr. and Mrs. Client, you have exposure to longevity risk. You have family members who have lived to 100, and we need to make sure that whatever we do, we put in place a risk management technique that allows you to protect against the risk of outliving your assets. Or many people say inflation is something that I need to protect against. How would I do it? Well, for many people, as you're aging and living in retirement, you might want to avoid investing in the stock market. There are very few investments other than equities that would allow you to keep pace with inflation and not lose your purchasing power. So you'll need to maybe mitigate and manage the risk of inflation with things that seem a little bit risky, but you might be living 30 years in retirement. So that's more than a few bull and bear market cycles. And I would not be afraid to invest in equities when you're older in order to protect against inflation, because the worst thing that could happen is having your standard of living lowered because you weren't keeping pace with inflation. There are some books to read about risk, and it's really a case where Olivia and Anna talk about this notion of sometimes we don't have a good sense of statistics, and these kind of books are accessible to the average person, written by Gerd Gigerenzer. I don't know. Has anyone read any of these books by chance? Anyone know it by chance? Well worth reading. Okay, let's go back to financial literacy for a second. I mentioned earlier that the average that people were spending on thinking about money during the week was about 8 hours on average. But if you spend more time on thinking about money, you're more likely to have a lower financial literacy. And if you spend less time, you're more likely to have higher financial literacy. So that might be a good thing to think about as you're sort of worried about money at work or on the weekends. All right, how financially fragile are you? How confident are you that you could come up with $2,000 if an unexpected need arose within the next month? You don't have to answer this, but this came out of the survey. If you could not come up with $2,000 or you were not certain you could come up with $2,000, you were deemed to be financially fragile. That comes from a different study, not the PinFin research. Now, an interesting thing about this from my perspective is, obviously, the greater your financial literacy, the less likely you are to be financially fragile. But the more financially fragile you are, especially as you age, the more likely it is that you'll be susceptible to scams and schemes later in life as you're being exposed to romance scams or grandparent scams or lottery scams or whatever the case may be. The interesting thing is this is actually quite new. Stanford has just launched something called the Initiative for Financial Decision Making to transform personal finance education. You can go to that link to learn more about it. You can go to Teaching Personal Finance conferences that Anna is running. And there's a new academic journal that's just been launched that Anna is the editor of. So if you're interested, there's a link to that journal. And if you really care about doing deep dives into the academics of financial literacy, I would recommend that you read that on a regular basis. So what did Lusardi and Mitchell learn? That we need to improve our levels of financial education and literacy. They're very low. And her thought, Anna's thought, and Olivia's thought is that we need to teach it not only in high school, but in college. And we need to do it in a way where we focus on the things where people are lacking sort of the knowledge, skills, and abilities to become better financial managers of their money. And that's especially around topics like risk and risk diversification. And her thought is it's different subgroups will have different tactics used to help them learn about money. The good news is Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont, John Pelletier runs this center, and they do an annual report card on states' efforts to introduce financial literacy programs to high school students. And in their most recent report, they and Next Gen Personal Finance have said that 26 states now require high school students to take a personal finance course before they graduate. So that's a great improvement over what it used to be. It's not perfect, and I'll take a moment to describe why, which is this. My daughter took a was required to take a personal finance course in high school when she was, I think, a junior. And everything that she learned, she forgot, in part because she never got a chance to use it in her life as a 16, 17-year-old. They were taught about credit cards, credit card scores, and how a credit score is created. But she didn't have a credit card. It was sort of meaningless almost to teach her about credit cards when she wasn't going to do that. She had to do an exercise on buying a car, what the car loan would cost. She had to do an exercise on getting a mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. So none of this mattered to her, even though the course was, good on the face of it, but just sort of ill-timed in terms of when it was presented to her. It reminds me of how I took French 8 years in elementary school, 4 years in high school, 2 years in college. I can't speak a whit of French, right? Because I don't use it, right? I don't use it in my daily life. So all those years of French, all for naught. Same with my daughter. It wasn't, we'll get to my daughter, the next part of the story. The good news here in Wisconsin, Governor Evers in December of 2023, everyone know this by chance, right? Signed into law a bill that would require students to earn at least 1/2 credit, 1 semester of personal financial literacy to graduate. That requirement will start in 2028, and they'll cover these topics: financial mindset, education and employment, money management, saving and investing, credit and debt, risk management, and insurance. And I think it's quite good that they're joining the ranks of the 26 other states that are requiring this. Did everyone know that by chance? Yes. Great. All right. So here are some of the organizations that are doing particularly, by the way, if anyone has a question along the way, feel free to not only heckle me, but to ask a question. Yes. Oh. Yeah. You were wondering what that echo in your ear was all this time? Glad I asked for the question. Anyone else? Questions? Oh, yes.
It's like, obviously, if I'm financially literate, I have the tools to be well off financially, but I could also imagine becoming financially well off, and now I have to learn how to do that. Right?
Yeah, so I'll get to that, but I'll give you a spoiler. So there's sort of two schools of thought, right? There's the paternalistic school that says you have to learn this stuff, and we're going to teach it to you. The other school of thought says we're going to just default you into a target date fund. You don't have to worry about risk diversification. You don't have to worry about rebalancing. You don't have to worry about asset allocation because we're doing it for you, right? Don't worry about the risk diversification. On the one hand, I think, yeah, that's a reasonable solution, but it's not perfect, right? Because you're still illiterate, right? And there will come a day when you think, is this right for me, right? And you won't have the tools to evaluate whether it's right for you. So I think on the one hand, if you're young, and I always say this, my daughter, she entered the workforce after she graduated. She's like, Dad, what should I do? I'm like, just sign up for your 401k and go in a target date fund, right? Because otherwise I would have to spend hours and hours and hours teaching her, right? Start there and we'll catch up, right? So that's what I would suggest is that this notion of let the market take care of some of your illiteracy, but don't let it take care of all your illiteracy, right? Catch up to it. That was my thought. Does that help? Good. Anyone else? I want someone to trade off with me. I'm not going to go through, in the deck, you'll have a listing of all these organizations and what they're doing. But according to Anna Lusardi, these are the organizations that are around the country that are doing a particularly good job at financial literacy. National Endowment for Financial Education, Council for Economic Education, Jumpstart, Next Gen Personal Finance, and then, of course, Anna's program at the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center. They're all doing kind of different things in different ways. So Jumpstart is particularly good at helping elementary school students. And someone like the Council on Economic Education is doing a particularly good job at high school level. And NEFI is also at the high school level as well. But I have a listing of all the things that they're doing. And it's probably well worth, if you want, when you get the deck, to look at the various details of what they're doing. So one of the interesting things that Anna and Olivia discovered is, well, how do we teach financial literacy? And one of the things that they discovered was it's not about necessarily trying to teach someone math, like here's the time value of money formula, go out and figure what the present value of this stream of cash flow is. It's more about storytelling. And that's something that can be relatable. Now, in their research, they looked at particularly things like compound interest, risk diversification, and inflation. And to me, one of the most interesting things was that risk diversification was most effective at improving knowledge in both the short and long term. But when they looked at compound interest and inflation, it significantly increased in the short term, but it didn't stick. So there's a case for me where it's either the story didn't work or the story needs to be reinforced more, because a once and done approach, and I'll say that probably multiple times today, a once and done approach just doesn't work when you're trying to teach someone about money. So you probably can't read this, but the essence of it is it's a story about compound interest where you have two people, both age 25. One starts investing exactly $200 a month at age 25, and the other says, the man in this case, I'm going to wait till I'm 35. I'm going to spend that $200 a month on discretionary expenses. I'm going to go to Taylor Swift conferences and whatever it is, and I'm not going to start till I'm 35. And at the end of when I get to reach retirement, the woman has $525,000 in her savings account, and the man only has $400,000. So a difference of $125,000. And the notion behind this story is it teaches someone about compound interest, which some say Einstein said is the eighth wonder of the world, but there's a great deal of debate about whether that's true or not. No one has ever found whether he really said that or not, but everyone says it. So, this story is the importance of starting retirement planning early in your life. At the moment you get into your job, start saving, because you'll earn that much more. And in the case of the man here, what his name was, Tom, Tom not only would have to start with $200, but he might have to start with $300 to catch up, right? So it's a matter of like, do you want to have to save a lot more later in life, or do you want to start saving a little in life and get there much more easily? All right. For me, the takeaways are this: high school courses are not enough. Maybe even college courses aren't enough. And I mentioned my daughter, and I think that was true. The high school course wasn't enough. And in my daughter's case, one of the things that's interesting, despite all the times that she and I would talk about money in the house, I don't know if it actually stuck or not. And when she got to work and signed up for a 401k, I'm not even sure it stuck then. And it wasn't until her company brought in the editor-in-chief of Investopedia and a woman called Mrs. Dow Jones. Does anyone know Mrs. Dow Jones? Okay, do you follow Mrs. Dow Jones on TikTok? Do you follow her advice? No. Okay. All right. So there's my daughter in the workplace. Mrs. Dow Jones is talking about investing and the need to be in the S&P 500 index fund and blah, blah, blah. And then it sort of clicked with my daughter. It wasn't until she heard Mrs. Dow Jones say it that it clicked. And she called me up and said, Dad, do I own an S&P 500 in my target date fund? I'm like, yeah, you do. And I was really happy at that moment because I thought, finally, right? Finally, it's happening. But it didn't happen, right, in high school. It didn't happen in college. It didn't even happen at the start of her career in the workplace. It happened because of ongoing financial education, which we'll talk about in a second. Not a one-and-done exercise. There's a need to become a lifelong learner around this subject. I write about I've been almost writing about retirement exclusively since 2004 or so. And my preference is to write somewhat longer articles than what you might get, even though I have written in USA Today, somewhat longer than what you might get in USA Today, because I want to make sure that people are getting all of the story. I don't want to send them elsewhere to learn something that they thought they should have learned in my article. And my editor sometimes refers to these stories as meaty, chewy. But she also refers to our readers as students of the subject, right? They're there because they want to learn. And they'll oftentimes, one of the metrics in the world of the internet is something called time on page. And so everyone is always evaluating how much time on page someone is spending on your article or your video or your podcast. And invariably, my time on page is higher than the average, in part because they're students of the subject. They want to learn. So I would suggest that in order to become financially literate, it's not just a one and done exercise. It's a sort of a lifelong learning exercise where you have to stay curious all the time. I like to use the example of my son who just entered the workforce as well. And he and I are always going back and forth about whether he should contribute to his traditional 401k at work or whether he should contribute to his Roth 401k. Everyone here know the difference between the two, right? So traditional, the money goes in pre-tax, grows tax-free, comes out, and it's taxed as ordinary income. The Roth is sort of just the opposite. It goes in on after-tax basis, grows tax-free, and the income comes out tax-free. And there's a great deal of debate, rules of thumb around this that would say, well, if you're in a high tax bracket now, or you're in a low tax bracket now, you do this or the other. But there's a great deal of research that's being produced about this topic as we go. It's not as if it's settled science yet. So I just sent my son an article that sort of disputed this notion of you should invest, you should contribute to your traditional 401k when you're in a higher tax bracket versus contributing to your Roth 401k. And it was interesting because it offered a different point of view. And I think we'll talk more about this when we get to the retirement planning section. But retirement planning is ultimately complicated, filled with contradictions, and it's really hard to decipher what to do, especially when the science is moving and the research might come out and contradict the thing that you thought was correct. And now you have to reevaluate whether what you're doing is actually in your best interest or not. So, stay curious. Don't think it's a set it and forget it thing. So this was the answer to your question. The worst case is default. Just default into your target date fund and the literacy will catch up, hopefully. Here's a list of some courses where if you haven't been exposed to any financial literacy courses, the University of Chicago offers a free course through Coursera, I believe, where I forget how long it is, maybe 8 or 12 weeks. And I think if you haven't been exposed to any financial education courses, this is as good as it gets. There are a couple others that have been identified by US News and World Report, where there are 12 others, including the one that's mentioned here. And it might be well worth doing it. I have interns who work for me for Retirement Daily on the Street. They come from Northeastern University. They're oftentimes just journalists. They've never had any exposure to money. And when they come to me, they say, you mean I have to write about retirement? And I'm like, yeah, you have to write about retirement, but don't worry. I want you to go take this course, and at least we'll give you some baseline knowledge of the things that you might be writing about, reporting on, and asking subject matter experts about. So I'd recommend that course from Illinois if you're interested. All right, so another takeaway for me, in order to become financially literate, you might need to establish what I describe as goals, incentives, and a coach. So the example I'll give you is last December, I had a total knee replacement. Brand new, back to playing hockey and pickleball and kayaking and biking. It was a total success. But what's interesting was after I had the total knee replacement, I was invited to participate in a research study out of Brigham and Mass General Brigham. And there were 3 groups of people that were being studied. One group received goals and a Fitbit. Another group received goals and financial incentives. And the incentives were really nominal. $5 a week if you hit the walking goal. And it started out like at 2,500 steps on average per week, and it went up to 10,000 steps over the course of I don't know, 12 weeks or so. And then the last group was goals, incentives, and a coach that you spoke to every week. I ended up in the 3rd group. And so I had my walking goals and my exercise goals. I had my Fitbit. I got $5 a week if I hit my walking goals, and $10 a week extra if I hit my exercise goals, 150 minutes a week. And then every Monday I would talk to my coach. And the coach, in a way, I didn't need the coach, but it was like bragging rights, because I never not earned my $15 a week over the course of that research study. It was great, right? In fact, one week, the Fitbit didn't log my steps, and the report came back and said, you didn't earn your $5. I'm like, no, I did earn my $5. And I called my coach, said that. I'm like, the Fitbit didn't log. I did it. There's no way. I did it. And so I was telling this story to Dr. Michael Finca, who was formerly at Texas Tech University. He studies a lot of retirement. And he said, you know, that's the perfect example to talk about because literacy is something where you might need a goal, where you might need an incentive, where you might need a coach to check in with. And he said, he reminded me that there was a study done where people who checked their account balance every day, I wouldn't recommend it, but every day, you know, were more financially literate and had a better outcome than those that didn't check their balance. Now, there's one thing wrong with checking your balance every day is like, because it goes up and down, right? You might start to do what average investors do, which is to sell at the bottom and buy at the top. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you do anything with that knowledge other than sort of check in, right? It's like checking in with maybe how many steps you did that day or check in with what your blood pressure is or something like that. But anyway, those are my charts. All the blue lines was when I exceeded the goals and the red lines are the goals I had. Bragging rights. Which brings me to this other notion, right? We live in a world where, in a way, MasterCard, Discover, American Express has won the battle for our wallet, right? They've made the bragging right the material good that you can buy. And I think the bragging right ought to be the exact opposite. My son today sends me his account balance in his 401k. He's bragging about how much he's been able to save in a short period of time in the workplace. Doesn't brag about like what watch he bought or what car he's leasing or what apartment whatever. He sends me his account balance. So if you're young and you enter the workforce, send your parents your account balance. Brag about that. You don't need a fancy watch. Okay. The other good news is maybe you had a course in high school, maybe you took a course in college. Now that you're in the workplace, the good news is financial employers are now increasingly offering wellness programs in the workplace. And this is a really good thing. If you enter the workplace, I mentioned already, Mrs. Dow Jones, if you enter the workplace, take advantage of all the wellness programs that are being offered to you. And there are many. They might be offering you help getting an emergency savings program going. Secured 2.0 has helped make that happen a little bit easier. Same with student loan repayment assistance. Because of the most recent retirement laws that were put in place, some employers, not all, but they have the ability if they want to, while you're making payments on your student loans, make a matching contribution to your retirement plan while you're paying your student loan, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, not every employer is doing it, but the law allows it. So if that's available to you and you have a student loan, take advantage of that opportunity. Same with personalized financial advice. And oftentimes you might have access to a coach in the workplace. Sometimes they might come in and do what's called a brown bag session. They'll be in the cafeteria and you'll have a chance to sign up and have a one-on-one session with a financial advisor. In the workplace, you might have access to a health savings account, which is a relatively somewhat new type of retirement savings account for healthcare expenses in retirement. Oftentimes people will come to me and say, I have an HSA at work, I have a traditional 401k, I have a Roth 401k, what should I contribute to first? And it's really interesting, the Vanguard has done a study about this and it's suggested ultimately a health savings account is maybe your best option as the first dollar in part because it's triple tax advantage. Money goes in tax-free, money grows tax-free, money comes out tax-free for qualified medical expenses. And in some cases, your employer will match some or all of contribution either on a percentage basis or on a dollar basis or on a flat dollar basis. And so that's a very good thing to consider if you have access to it. Now, I will tell you that some people who sign up for this, they have to have a high deductible health plan at work, which means that in many cases, if you're young, you may not have medical expenses, but if you're young and have medical expenses, you may find yourself in that terrible position of deciding whether you should use the money in your HSA to pay for medical expenses or use other money to pay for medical expenses. Nonetheless, I would say if you have an HSA at work, think about it. When they were introduced by President Bush way back when, they were described as an IRA for healthcare expenses in retirement. And at the moment, most Americans who have these have relatively low balances in them, in part because they use them for current medical expenses. But you do have the opportunity to invest your HSA money just as you would an IRA. You can invest in mutual funds, in ETFs. You don't have to invest only in a CD. And if the money won't be used for 40 or 50 years hence, there's no reason to keep it in money in investments that offer just safety of principal. So we'll talk more about behavioral finance, but one of the things that is happening in the workplace now is when you go in, they're taking advantage of work that Richard Thaler did. Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize winner from University of Chicago, as among other things, and helped create the auto enrollment programs that are in the workplace, as well as the auto escalation programs. So the auto enrollment programs work like this. There was a time when you went into the workplace and you were asked if you wanted to participate in your 401k or 403b or 457 plan. And what they realized was enrollments were pretty low. No one signed up, right? No one thought, well, this is a good thing. So the regulations now allow companies to auto enroll people into the 401k. You actually now have to opt out of these programs, which is great because now you're saving for retirement. And in many cases, you also would be auto enrolled maybe around 3%. And then the company would match, say, 1.5% of that or so. The problem at 3% is it's not enough, right? Most financial advisors, Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock, all say that maybe you should be saving somewhere at least 10% and upwards of 15%. So what they found was that when people were being auto-enrolled at 3%, wasn't working because they weren't adjusting upward their contribution rates. So they created auto escalation where now people can be automatically escalated from a 3% contribution rate to 4, 5, 6, et cetera. So you get closer and closer to the 9 and 10% with auto escalation. And then, of course, the default investment options are now typically target date funds where when you enroll, does everyone know what a target date fund is? Should I explain it quickly? I know you're nodding your head. No one's shaking their nose. No one's shaking. No, of course not, right? All right. So anyway, the notion of the target date fund, just briefly, is you're investing in a fund where it anticipates what your retirement date will be, and then the asset mix starts out probably a little bit risky, maybe like 80% stocks and 20% bonds, and then gradually becomes more conservative at the closer you get to your retirement date or the target date of the fund. Okay. So I spend my, so I sometimes say I have the most depressing job in America writing about retirement. And there was a time when I first started writing about retirement, I would ask my wife how her day was at dinner, and she would ask me how my day was. And I would tell her, oh, another survey came in that said, we haven't saved enough. We're going to outlive our assets. We're going to spend $500,000 on healthcare and retirement. And it got to a point because I would tell her that, every day, yet another new study would come in with this depressing news about the state of retirement in America. And eventually she stopped asking me how my day was. It was just depressing, right? I was depressed. I was like, maybe I should have chosen a different profession like entertainment or something. I don't know. Anyway, so it's depressing and it's not easy. So in the PFIN index study, they added some subjects around retirement. They asked people questions around Social Security, Medicare, retirement savings from an employer, lifetime income, life expectancy, and retirement. And the sad thing is people only got 2 of the 5 questions right. Told you it's depressing. All right, I'm not going to go through all these, but these are the questions. You can go back and read them and see how well you do on these questions to see if you get more than 2 or 5 right. All right, so why is it so hard to plan for retirement? Well, I mentioned this a second ago. It's complicated. It's filled with contradictions. It's confusing. And it's always changing. Every day, a new law, a new research report, a new product comes out, and you have to keep pace. Years and years ago, does everyone know what a reverse mortgage is by chance? Okay. Years ago, that didn't exist really, right? No, HSAs didn't exist, and now they do. Roth IRAs didn't exist. 529 plans didn't exist. So every year there's something new. Insurance companies, mutual fund companies, brokerage firms, they're all famous for introducing new things out in the marketplace. Most recently, insurance companies have introduced something called the Registered Index Linked Annuity. RILA is what they call it. So there's yet one more thing that you might have to become literate about to see whether it works for you or not. I said it's complicated. So Bob Keebler, who runs an accounting firm out of Green Bay says, if you own an IRA and you're still living, this is what happens. But if you should die, here's what happens depending on who you've named as your beneficiary. And I look at this chart and I think, why in the world would anyone ever want to own an IRA? Like, that's just too hard, right? Ultimately, it's not that hard, but it does make it look onerous, doesn't it? Like, dang. All right. So here's another thing. One of the things I do when I'm writing about retirement is I'll often go on SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, and I'll look for new research that's been published about retirement. A couple of years ago, Olivia Mitchell wrote an article called Money in Motion, Dynamic Portfolio Choice in Retirement. I don't know if you can see it, but the up top is some of the content from that paper. And I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. I couldn't quite figure out whether she was predicting a hurricane to hit Boston or whether she was saying that no one would have a safe retirement. So anyway, I sent it to one of my subject matter experts, and he said, after reading that thing for a while, I realized that I can't really assess much of it. And it appears that I lack the math skills to follow much of what they're arguing. And so, my job of trying to translate the academic research into plain English for the benefit of people sort of failed on this one because it's just too complicated. I'm pretty sure there's a story in this research. I just couldn't get it. And I mentioned there's lots of contradictory opinions out there. So the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, run by Alicia Minnell, has written numerous reports. They run something called the National Retirement Risk Index. And what they have shown consistently over the years of running this index is about 50% of the people surveyed are at risk of having a retirement that is well below their desired standard of living. Andrew Biggs, on the other hand, is over at the American Enterprise Institute. And Andrew will say, all that research is flawed. There is no retirement crises. The real crisis is caused by politicians. Everything that you read is misleading about the crises. Yeah, there are some people that might be living a life that's below their desired state of living, but in the main, no crises. So who do you believe, Alicia Minnell or Andrew Biggs? That's what I say. Yeah, beats the heck out of me. All right. So the other thing that we just launched a podcast at Yahoo Finance. Sign up for it if you can. I'm not a great podcast person. I'm an ink stain, wretch. So, my background is around sitting in front of a typewriter instead of like speaking to people on a podcast. Anyway, we've done some pretty good podcasts already. We have great guests coming. And one of the things that we try to do is maybe simplify it, right? Take someone from, I like to say, from street level to curbside. Just give them enough working knowledge. And usually I'm not a big fan of rules of thumb, but sometimes I think they're a great starting place. And this is a great starting place for someone who wants to see, well, what should I be saving by which age? This comes from Fidelity. T. Rowe Price has a very similar table. Lincoln Financial has a similar table. And I'd say aim for this. If you're age 30, you should have 1 times your salary set aside in your 401k. By the time you get to be 67, the number's typically around 10 to 12 times. That's what you should have saved for retirement in your nest egg. And that could be all of your nest egg, right? It could be your IRAs, your 401ks, could be your taxable accounts, whatever you have earmarked for retirement is the target to be there. And this is a good way to think about it because now instead of saying, more often than not, when people go to a financial advisor, they go at age 55 or they go at age 60. And the question that they always ask the financial advisor is, do I have enough? Do I have enough? And in this case, you might not need a financial advisor. You might be able to just I think you might need a financial advisor as your assets grow. No way. Really? 15? Okay. Oh my goodness. All right. So use this as a benchmark when you enter the workforce. And then, as your life becomes more complicated, as your assets grow, think about the coach model. The other thing to think about as a rule of thumb is to say, well, my target is to replace 70 to 80% of my pre-retirement income in retirement. So if you're earning whatever, $100,000, you would shoot for $70,000 of income some of which would come from Social Security, some of which might come from a pension, some of which might come from personal assets, some of which could come from a reverse mortgage or the cash value in your life insurance. So just think about all the sources of income that get you to that 70%. There's another model called the living standards replacement rate. It's a little bit more complicated. I gave you the link to it if you want to read more about doing something that's a little bit more sophisticated than using the 70% model. All right, if you're just starting out, anyone know who that is? By chance? Where are my economists in the room? You know who that is? Okay. All right. Well, that's Modigliani, right? Wins the Nobel Prize for the life cycle hypotheses. And the thought here is when you're just starting out in your career, maybe you don't need to save. Maybe the thing to do is to dissave, right? Maybe the thing to do when you're young is to borrow to invest in your human capital, right? Because when you're young, and I'll show you in a second, when you're young, you have more human capital, right? The present value of your stream of earned income from your employer, more so than your financial capital. And then when you sort of get to this other point, you'll be above the curve and you'll be able to save a lot more. And then when you get to retirement, you dissave again. So it might look like this. When you're young, the value of your human capital might be like 80% of your total capital, and your financial capital might be 10 or 5%, right, relative. And as you age, your stream of earnings declines. And so your human capital declines, but as you've been setting aside money, your financial capital rises. So think about this as you enter the workforce, and think about it also in this way, which is increasingly people who go into the workforce, if they go to work at Apple or Microsoft or name any high-tech company on the West Coast, they might get something called restricted stock units as part of their compensation, which are technically non-tradable wealth. But the thought is you need to account for that when you're building your asset allocation, when you're building your investment plan. So now you need to think about my human capital. Well, it's all tied up in my employer. I'm now getting these RSUs, which are tied up in my employer. And now I may need to invest my money a little bit differently because of the risk that's involved in my human capital for my employer and the RSUs that I'm also getting. So over at Morningstar, they've created a research report. There's the link to it. And you'll be able to read about how you might think about this a little bit further, how you become more sophisticated about making sure that you're reducing the risk and improving the risk-adjusted return from your total capital. All right, the other thing that you need to become familiar with about, especially about retirement planning, are all the behavioral biases and cognitive biases that affect you. And I think the ones that I like to highlight, for me anyway, was present bias. When I was age 25, I didn't know about present bias, right? The notion of the dollar today was worth more to me than the dollar tomorrow, right? But if you didn't have hyperbolic discounting, you'd be more like the ant than the grasshopper, right? You'd be salting away the food for the time when you don't have any. And so when you're young, think about the ant and grasshopper story. In some cases, people have suggested that you use an aging app when you're young to see how you might look so that your 25-year-old self thinks about your 65-year-old self. It's not pretty. A word of warning. I've done it, and I didn't post my face here, but it's worth doing. Shlomo Bernatzi over at, I think he's at Stanford these days, was a big proponent of this aging app. I mentioned becoming a student of the subject. All these are links to various papers and articles that talk about the life cycle theory. Moshe Milevsky up at York University wrote a book, a really great book that I recommend to you all. It's called Are You a Stock or Are You a Bond? And the notion behind that is if you're a teacher, maybe your income is steady and stable. That's like a bond. So maybe you should invest more aggressively in your 401k than someone otherwise might. But if you're a venture capitalist and your income is going up and down, you're more like a stock. So maybe your investment portfolio should more be heavily invested in bonds or fixed income. All right. So I run Retirement Daily on the street, and we started a series that we call Man vs. Machine, where what we do is we ask Chat, GPT, a personal finance question, and then we ask a subject matter expert to critique it. What did it get right? What did it get wrong? What were the material omissions? Don't ever use AI for your personal finance questions, ever. ever, ever. Like, people are like, oh, it's like WebMD. And, maybe you trust WebMD for a medical question. No, you don't. Okay. I've never tested WebMD in the man versus machine thing, but the thought here is it doesn't get it right, especially chat, which doesn't source the information. So maybe Perplexity is a little bit better because at least it's giving you the source, but it's not entirely correct either. And Gemini, likewise, similar to chat, it's not giving you the source, so it's really hard to verify where the information is coming from. All right, I'm gonna buzz through. How much time do I have, B? Okay. All right. I'm gonna buzz through this because we're at the time permitting spot. All right. Let's two things. The Fed cut interest rates. I'm not going to go through all the effects it has on credit cards, et cetera, job prospects, blah, blah, blah. What I want you to do, though, is go to bankrate.com. Has anyone ever been there by chance to read about stuff? They do a fantastic job of looking at the state of affairs with credit cards, with CDs, with savings rates, calculators, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really great site to get a sense of things, including there's a wonderful article about the impact of the Fed cutting interest rates on young adults. What I would say is, here's what I think is really important for all the young adults and others as well in the room is, do you know what your credit score is? Do you know how it's calculated? I had an interesting experience. One of my sons, I have triplet sons, by the way. They're age 29 now. They're all contributing members of society. But one of my sons says to me early after he got a job, Dad, I can't get my credit rating any higher. There's what credit scores look like. Can't get it any higher because my length of credit is only 1 year. It's 2 years, right? It's not very long. Well, it only counts for 15% of how your credit score is calculated. But he had gone on YouTube to learn how to improve his credit score. Didn't ask his dad. What do I know, right? Chopped liver. They learned how to tie a bow tie on YouTube too, right? They didn't ask me. Of course, I wouldn't have helped them much with a bow tie, but anyway. So know how your credit score is calculated. Know what a good score is versus a not so good score because it will impact what your interest rate is on your car loans, on your mortgage rates, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting thing is this comes from a consumer education manager at Experian because I posed the question, how do I improve my credit score if all I have is a short credit history? And she said, it's only 15%. The thing that matters most of all is, did you pay on time and is your balance low? And a lot of times people say, oh, I got to keep my balance at 30% or lower. She's like, no, 0. Pay it off. Don't even have it there, right? You have a balance, pay it down and pay it on time. In the old days, we didn't have auto payment, right? There's no reason to ever be late on a credit card payment now. All right, let's go. Do I want to talk about it? Yeah, okay, let's talk about this. This is good for all the young students in the room as well. Elder fraud is on the rise, according to the FBI. 12.5 billion. And the two scams that I think are really important to know would be, well, you should know about something called pig butchering. It's a term of art that's going on in the world of like romance scams. You should know that AI is increasingly problematic in the world of scams and schemes. Warren Buffett, at his annual meeting, said there was an AI video of him created touting an investment. And it was so real that he thought, if I didn't know any better, I would have thought it was me, Warren Buffett. Okay. So let me go back to the two things, the grandparent relative in distress scam and the romance scam. So because of AI, the grandparent relative in distress scam is on the rise. So in the old days, someone might call and say, hey, Grandpa, do you know who this is? And Grandpa would be like, Johnny? Yeah, it's me, Johnny. I'm stuck in Mexico and I'm in jail and I need bail money because, well, they blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so, then next thing you know, Grandpa's sending Johnny, someone, right, money to get him down in jail. Scam. Now, because of AI, someone has Johnny's voice already from TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube, or wherever the case may be, and now can deep fake it, right? Can put it in 11labs.com. And next thing you know, the person's not saying, hey, Grandpa, do you know who this is? It's now, Grandpa, it's Johnny. It sounds like Johnny. bad. So AI is really, really bad with the grandparent relative and distress scam. Romance scams. A lot of times people are going on whatever, some sort of dating app, or they're on Facebook. Maybe they're divorced, maybe they're widowed, they're lonely, and strike up a friendship with someone who thinks that they're interesting. They're overseas, they're in the military, they work for an oil exploration company, something or other. And then along the way, the person that you think you know says, I've been investing in this blah, blah, blah thing. Maybe you should try it. And then they send them a fake investment statement. And then the person puts a little money in it. And then the person sends back a fake investment statement saying how much their money grew. Maybe you should put more money in it. And so it goes until they groom the pig, they feed the pig, and then they slaughter the pig. They take the money and they're gone, never to be seen from or heard from again. And the money can't be recovered. I spoke a little bit ago. There's a group of advisors in Indianapolis, 300 of them. I asked them how many of their clients have been scammed or schemed in these kind of cases. Every single person raised their hand. All 300 advisors raised their hand. How many of you had money recovered? None of them. Someone came up to me afterwards and said that they had a client, had a $3 million IRA. The woman got involved in a romance scam. The guy asked for the $3 million. She gave it to him and disappeared. So not only was she out $3 million, she also had to pay ordinary income taxes on the distribution. It's bad. All right. So what can you do? Well, Wayne State University has an Institute for Gerontology, and they've done some really great work around what the risk factors are. They've created an assessment tool that you can use where you can either work on your own or with a professional to identify whether you're susceptible to a scam or scheme. So for all your young kids here, go ask your parents to take it. You want to make sure that they're not going to be susceptible to a scam or scheme. And some of the risk factors are depression or low social fulfillment needs. Some of them are cognitive impairments. Others would be marital status. I mentioned unmarried individuals are particularly susceptible. African Americans are also at increased risk. Living alone, social isolation, lack of a financial advisor, all these factors contribute to being scammed and schemed. If you go, this is a website to go to get the assessment tool. It's called olderadultnestegg.com, and they can help assess your decision making. And one of the things I might recommend is, even if you do the decision making assessment and it says no problems, take it annually, because they categorize you into 3 categories. No problems, maybe you have a problem, or you would have a big problem. And so what you want to do is assess things as you go, in part because as you age, your financial numeracy sadly declines, but your confidence level in your decisions rises. So you start to make increasingly bad decisions, and you're confident that you made the right one. And this is one of the cruel things that we do to older Americans. We make them decide what Medicare plan to enroll in each and every October, right? The moment you turn 65, every single year thereafter, you have to decide which Medicare plan is best for you. It's crazy. All right, so go to olderadultnestegg.com, plenty of resources there that you might need. They also have a program if you've ever been scammed or schemed. They have the SAFE program. They have licensed social workers on staff where they can help you sort of try to recover your money, file police reports, get some psychological help around the sort of the shame. A lot of times what happens, by the way, is the 12.5 billion number that I mentioned that the FBI reported is actually quite lower than it really is, because many of these cases aren't being reported because of people being shamed around losing $3 million. Okay, last thing I'll mention is, how are we doing? B? Okay, I'll mention this last thing because I think it's the last thing I was going to mention anyway. So as you heard, I run this course at the Financial Planning Association around elder planning, helping financial advisors tailor their practice or acquire the knowledge that they need to deal with an aging client base. And one of the things that we talk about are the legal documents that older adults might need. But the truth of the matter is there are some legal documents that anyone who's 18 or older needs, because you probably don't have it, which is a HIPAA release. You have a HIPAA release, guys? No? All right, so a HIPAA release is ultimately the document that enables a medical professional to talk to someone if you are unable to talk for yourself, let's say. So let's say, for example, you get into a car accident, you're unable to speak, your parents come down to talk to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have a HIPAA release. They're like, no, I don't have a HIPAA release. You need a HIPAA release because you're 18 and I'm not allowed to talk to you, even though you're a parent, about the medical condition. So a HIPAA release is probably, if you leave here and do nothing else tonight, make sure you have a HIPAA release so that if ever something happens to you and you're unable to speak for yourself and you need someone to talk to a medical professional, have a HIPAA release. Now, I will tell you that a lot of medical professionals will be like, HIPAA release, SHMIPA release, right? They'll still talk. But it would be far better in the case where they won't have it. So that what I would recommend is, there's a lot of other elder planning things in here that you need to consider. Will, DNRs, advanced directives, healthcare proxy for healthcare, or proxy for healthcare, healthcare proxy for financial matters. I know it's tiny, but when you get the deck, you'll be able to see all the legal documents that you need to put in place, not only for yourself if you're young, but especially if you're older and you're getting to a point where maybe you're experiencing cognitive decline and you're still confident about the decisions that you're making, and your children or your loved ones don't know what you have in place to avoid a crisis, which is the one thing that older adults often say is, I don't want to be a burden on my children. And if they really didn't want to be a burden on their children, they would have all these documents. So I'll take some questions, B. I think I did it. Oh. Oh. There's where you can reach me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Yahoo Finance Market Watch, and my email if you want to email me. Oh, is it being recorded? Do you need to run it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. You'll get one right there. Yeah.
You had mentioned planning by benchmarks. A lot of the financial ed I've had is all about planning by benchmarks or rules of thumb.
Mhm.
Do you subscribe to this idea that we should be doing that? And when you did mention them, what's interesting about is the 8% rule. That if you look at that combined set of investment portfolios, you should be able to withdraw no more than 8% per year in retirement.
So that's what Dave Ramsey says. What? Well, so Bill Bengen, 40 years ago now, wrote the seminal paper where he said 4% was the amount that you could withdraw using a 50-50 portfolio and not run out of money for 30 years. It's a good place to start, right? If you were ballparking like how much income you needed in retirement. So let's say, for example, you need 100,000 in retirement and you're going to get $30,000 from Social Security and you have $1 million portfolio, which means you could draw $40,000, right? So now I'm at 70,000, I need 30,000, I'm below. Now you might say, well, maybe I should withdraw 8%, right? But then you run the risk of that portfolio declining faster than your lifespan. And if that should happen, then your desired standard of living is below what you want it to be. And to me, that represents a failure in retirement, right? You want to have a consistent desired standard of living throughout retirement. So I would say start there, right? But the truth of the matter is you're going to adjust it. So the other thing about retirement expenses is they're lumpy. So you might start retirement, they refer to the retirement periods as go-go, slow-go, no-go years. And in the go-go years, you're probably going to spend a lot more than you will in the no-go years. And so maybe 8% might work at the start, but you wouldn't want it to be consistent throughout, especially because your spending is going to decline anyway. The interesting thing about 8% is if you were to do it consistently, you probably would run out of money before you die, which means that the only other plan would be to die sooner, right? Not the best plan. But the other interesting thing about retirement is a lot of times people end up at the end of retirement with more money than they started retirement with because they're afraid to spend. So it's sort of a between thing, right? I wouldn't do 8% forever, but most advisors say, I'm here to give you permission to spend early in retirement because we've done the plan, right? And I look at retirement income planning as a spreadsheet, as a row and column exercise, right? Year by year, I'm going to make adjustments to my spending, to my withdrawal patterns. There's a gentleman out of Minnesota, John Guyton. He refers to creating guardrails around your spending, around your withdrawal. So maybe if the market's up, maybe I do withdraw 8. If the market's down, maybe I withdraw 2, right? So it's not a set and forget it, but I think it's a good place to start to think, do I have enough income for my portfolio? That help? Thanks. Oh, no. 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 The last time this happened, I got fired.
No, this one's an easy one. So I see a lot of very young faces in here tonight, and you talk about, the necessity or that it would be great to not only have goals, but to also have a coach. So if people are looking to find their coach or their financial advisor, what would you suggest that they consider?
So this is right. So the big problem with the financial advice industry is a lot of times an advisor might say, well, you don't have enough assets for me, right? My minimum's $1 million, right? When you're like, I'm just starting out. I've got like $20,000 in my 401k. So what I might recommend, there are a couple places to go. There are a number of people who are fee-only financial advisors who will just consult with you on an hourly basis. So maybe for $300 or $400 an hour, you might get a consultation with someone who you could trust, sounding board. That's one. There are a number of these people in what's called the XY Planning Network. They're mostly young advisors who are in their 30s and 40s, just starting out. But they'll do right by you, right? Because they're not earning a commission to sell you anything. They're just trying to help you get started. In the workplace, you might have access to a financial coach as well. And I would go, certainly if you're in the workplace, I would do that. In other cases, if things are a bit dire, the Financial Planning Association has a pro bono service, which is really good. So it's really for extreme cases, right? Extreme credit card debt, et cetera, that kind of thing. And then there's another network called the Cheryl Garrett Network. They do hourly planning as well. So I think between XY, Cheryl Garrett, the workplace, and worst case, pro bono. That help? Thanks for not firing me.
Just to add to that, another source would be a parent's financial advisor.
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. So oftentimes, financial advisors are working with a parent. And oftentimes what happens is the advisor disregards the parent's children for lots of different reasons. But what happens is when the parent dies, because the advisor didn't have a relationship with the child, whatever money you had left over, 80% of the time that money leaves to go to another advisor. So it's a great bit of advice, because if you want to sort of maintain continuity, have your parent's advisor talk to you as well. Thank you. Are you an advisor? Where do you work?
Yes.
Where? Okay.
If someone was considering a career in getting into financial planning, advising, what characteristics do you think those individuals would need to have?
What characteristics?
Yes.
I think so. Obviously, great sort of analytical skills, right? You've got to be able to Monte Carlo simulations, present value calculations, understanding how Roth IRA conversions affect IRMA, like just lots of technical knowledge and analytical skills. And then I think a lot of empathy. So the times when I hear people compliment their financial advisor is they get me, right? They truly get me as a person. They understand me, right? They don't look at me as a nest egg, right? They know my family. They know my aspirations. They're working hard in my best interests. And I think it's sort of a combination of technical skills and soft skills. And I should mention too, obviously I have my certified financial planner certification. It's probably well worth. Yeah, I mean, all that's required by FINRA, but I would also get or additional certification. You know, the CFP has become in part the gold standard for financial planners. There's about 100,000 of them now. It's certainly not enough. The other thing too, I often say is that if we had to build the financial advice profession from scratch, that it would look nothing like it looks today, right? I entered a financial advice industry that was largely a commission-based industry. It was sort of like the near equivalent of a, forgive me, like a pharmaceutical salesman, you know, doling out prescription drugs to people, right? You know, and I think the model would be more akin to the legal, the accounting, the medical profession, if you were to sort of recreate this. Right now, we have insurance agents reporting to state insurance boards. We have Series 7 people reporting to FINRA. We have registered investment advisors reporting to the Securities Exchange Commission or their state securities commission. And there's no uniformity among that, right? And then add to it this notion that if you're a registered investment advisor, you have to be a fiduciary, right? You have to always act in your client's best interest. On the other hand, if you're just a Series 7 advisor reporting to FINRA, you merely have to do what's suitable. And the big difference between suitability and best interest. So we live in a world today where if you go into a financial advisor, you'll forgive me, right? You might end up having to say, are you doing what's merely suitable for me, or are you acting in my best interest? And that's a question that you would never ask your doctor, right? You would never say, are you just doing what's suitable here? Or, you know, no, they took an oath to do no harm. So I think in the case of the financial advice profession, to me, wouldn't it be great if it was more like I'm in the do no harm environment versus the suitable environment? And we can talk and disagree later.
Well, we are about
All
out of
right.
time.
I think we did it.
We did it. Excellent.
Thank you, everyone.